What turns ordinary college students into monsters? In 1971, Stanford University psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to answer this question through a simple experiment. Take 24 psychologically stable young men, divide them randomly into prisoners and guards, place them in a simulated prison environment, and watch what happens. But as the basement corridors of Stanford's psychology building transformed into a makeshift prison, something went terribly wrong. In this video, we uncover how a scientific study meant to last 2 weeks had to be shut down after only 6 days, when the line between experiment and nightmare completely disappeared. It was the summer of 1971, and Stanford University's psychology building stood calm and ordinary. But within its basement walls, something far from ordinary was about to unfold. An experiment so profound it would shake our understanding of human behavior to its core. What happens when you take psychologically sound, average young men and immerse them in a world of complete power imbalance? This was the question that psychologist Philip Zimbardo sought to answer, and he had a bold, ambitious plan to find out. In his own words, this was more than an experiment. It was a simulation meant to peel back the layers of human nature, to test the boundaries of morality, authority, and identity. But what no one anticipated was just how far those boundaries could stretch, or break, under the influence of power and control. To truly understand the psychological power of imprisonment, Zimbardo and his team knew they had to create a space that felt as real as possible. They transformed a simple basement corridor into a bleak, stark prison. 3 rooms became cells, each holding 3 prisoners, while a dark closet was ominously labeled the Hole, designated for solitary confinement. Even the lighting felt oppressive, adding to the growing sense of unease that soon seeped into every crevice of the building. The chosen participants, healthy, psychologically sound college students, were quickly stripped of their identities. Those assigned as prisoners were given simple, shapeless smocks marked only with numbers. No names, no personal items, just numbers that dehumanized them, reducing their sense of self with each passing hour. Around their ankles, a heavy chain clinked with every step, reinforcing their sense of powerlessness. Meanwhile, the guards wore khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses that obscured their eyes, rendering them faceless enforcers of the prison's rules. With those sunglasses, they never had to meet the prisoner's eyes, never had to feel the weight of empathy or the burden of connection. This simple barrier de-individuated them, removing any sense of personal accountability. Zimbardo once remarked, "Our goal was to create an environment that was as psychologically real as possible. We wanted to see how easily people could lose themselves in roles defined entirely by a situation. Little did we know how far it would go." From the moment they entered the mock prison, the dehumanization began. The prisoners were stripped of their clothes, their belongings confiscated. They were left standing, vulnerable and exposed, before being handed nothing more than a smock, a loose, shapeless dress-like garment with a number printed across the front. The impact was swift and severe. The simple act of being referred to by a number instead of a name reinforced their powerlessness. The chain around their ankle, although light, weighed on them psychologically. It was a humiliating symbol of their imprisonment. Prisoner number 8612 was the first to break. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, he began showing signs of severe emotional distress. His hands trembled, his speech became disorganized, and he was overcome with uncontrollable fits of rage and sobbing. When confronted by the guards, number 8612 was told he could be an informant, an attempt to manipulate and further isolate him from the others. It pushed him even further into despair. By the time Zimbardo and his team finally intervened to release him, the line between reality and roleplay had blurred beyond recognition. Prisoner number 8612 had come to believe that he truly had no control, no escape, no identity beyond what had been forced upon him. The simulated prison had succeeded, not just as a study, but as a harrowing experiment in the fragility of human identity under dehumanizing conditions. While the prisoners were stripped of their identities, the guards were being given new ones infused with power. Dressed in crisp khaki uniforms and carrying billy clubs, the guards were transformed from college students into symbols of authority. At the start, many of these young men hesitated, unsure of how to act the part. But it didn't take long for their roles to consume them. As the hours turned to days, the guards became increasingly authoritarian. They enforced the rules with a level of aggression that was as shocking as it was effective. They created arbitrary punishments, subjected prisoners to humiliation, and pushed them to their psychological breaking points. How did this happen so quickly? The answer lies in the power of symbols. The uniforms, billy clubs, and sunglasses weren't just props. They were tools of transformation. The anonymity provided by the sunglasses severed personal accountability. This loss of personal identity, combined with the symbols of authority they carried, allowed them to act in ways they never would have considered outside the prison walls. One guard, later known as John Wayne, became a notorious figure in the experiment. He created his own brand of sadistic punishment, using psychological tactics to break the prisoners' spirits. In post-experiment interviews, he reflected on how easily he slipped into the role. "I didn't plan things out ahead of time," he said, "but there was a moment I realized just how much I enjoyed the power. Acting authoritatively can be fun." The guards weren't inherently cruel, but the environment encouraged them to become so. The experiment revealed how situational factors and symbols of power can corrupt even the most ordinary people. What was unfolding in that basement wasn't just an experiment. It was a chilling transformation of human behavior, revealing just how thin the veneer of civilization can be when authority is left unchecked. It's easy to picture Philip Zimbardo as an objective scientist, calmly observing the results of his landmark study. But in reality, he was far from an impartial bystander. From the moment he donned the title of prison superintendent, Zimbardo became a part of the experiment he had designed. His primary responsibility as a psychologist was to ensure the well-being of his participants. Yet, as the days unfolded, he became increasingly focused on maintaining the structure and authority of his prison. As the guards grew more aggressive and the prisoners more desperate, Zimbardo allowed it to continue, rationalizing the suffering as necessary for the experiment. One of the most striking moments came with prisoner number 819. After breaking down in tears, number 819 was taken to a room to rest. But the guards lined up the remaining prisoners and had them chant, "Prisoner number 819 did a bad thing." The chants echoed through the halls and number 819 could hear every word. Consumed by guilt, he wept even harder, insisting he couldn't leave because he had been labelled a bad prisoner. It was only when Zimbardo finally addressed him not as a prisoner, but by his real name, reminding him that he was a free man and that this was all an experiment, that number 819 snapped out of his role. Zimbardo later admitted how fully he had lost himself. He said, "By the third day, I had already slipped into the role of prison superintendent. I was no longer a psychologist worried about ethics. I was thinking like a warden, more concerned with running a prison than protecting the well-being of the young men I was supposed to be studying." Zimbardo's transformation underscored the very findings of his own experiment. Under the right circumstances, even those with the best intentions can be swept up in the roles they are given. The experiment had revealed the fragility of human empathy when faced with the allure of authority and power. Throughout the unfolding chaos, nearly 50 observers came and went, without challenging the morality of what was happening. But then came Christina Maslach, a young Stanford PhD who had been invited to interview the participants. She stepped into the basement prison expecting to see a routine experiment. But what she found was far from ordinary. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Seeing prisoners huddled in fear and guards reveling in their power left her shaken to the core. She confronted Zimbardo, her voice quivering with disbelief, and demanded an explanation. "It's terrible what you're doing to these boys," she cried, her eyes wide with shock. For the first time, Zimbardo was forced to step back and see the horror he had orchestrated. His role as superintendent had clouded his judgment, but Maslach's words shattered the illusion. This was no longer a study of human behavior. It had become a nightmare, one that he had the power to end. Just 6 days in, Zimbardo announced that the experiment would be terminated. He later admitted that Maslach was the only person who had questioned the experiment's morality, making her intervention not just significant, but crucial. The Stanford prison experiment was over, but its repercussions were only beginning. It became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of human ethics under situational pressures. The young men who played the roles of prisoners and guards had glimpsed a darker side of themselves, and Zimbardo had confronted the moral complexities of his own creation. Today, the study remains a cautionary tale, showing just how easily ordinary people can be drawn into systems of power, becoming complicit in acts they may never have imagined. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Stanford prison experiment is its message about human nature. We like to think of ourselves as moral and rational beings, confident that we would resist oppressive systems or stand against tyranny if it arose. Many people believe that, faced with injustices like those in history, they would have the courage to act. But the experiment suggests otherwise, that under the right conditions, anyone can lose themselves to the roles they are given, finding it easier to conform than to resist. Zimbardo has since acknowledged the experiment's ethical failures. "We didn't anticipate how real it would become," he admitted, "but it was a lesson for all of us, a lesson in how deeply situations can shape our behavior." As we look back on this controversial chapter in psychological history, the question lingers: how many of us truly know what we would do if placed in the same situation? The Stanford prison experiment remains one of the most unsettling yet thought-provoking studies in the history of psychology. The experiment raises questions that still haunt us today. How do we create systems that prevent the abuse of power? How do we ensure that the humanity of every individual is protected, even in the most hierarchical environments? And perhaps most importantly, could we, too, fall prey to these situational forces if we were placed in the same roles? In a world where authority often goes unquestioned, the Stanford prison experiment challenges us to reflect on our own actions and the structures we uphold. It's a reminder that the capacity for both cruelty and compassion lies within us all, and that the strength of our society is measured by how vigilantly we guard against the darkness that resides within all of us. Remember, every crime has a story, every story has a lesson.